It is March 28th. We are on the 6th chapter of the book of Ezra. Who would like to begin? In English reading.
Oh, I can read it.
Please, s'il vous plaît.
Thereupon, at the order of King Darius, they searched the archives where the treasures were stored in Babylon.
Okay, so as a reminder, we've seen it as a motif, but they were building. Second time that they were building. The first time they were building, it got stopped. That was its own long Misa. This time they were building, and when the official representatives of the Persian Empire come to stop them, they say, "No, we have permission for this," and they write back to King Darius to ask if the returned exiles have permission to build God's house. The letter is very, very different than the first letter. It's not antagonistic. It clearly is in a different context, one that's much friendlier. And we had the extent of the whole letter. We had the extent of their letter asking back. And now, this is the search. When their letter arrives in Persia, actually in Babylon, King Darius has the archives searched.
But it was in the citadel of Ecbatana, in the province of Media, that a scroll was found in which the following was written. Memorandum.
Okay, so Ecbatana, modern-day city of Hamadran in Iran, summer palace of the Persian kings. Who knew? All right.
In the first year of King Cyrus issued an order concerning the house of God in Jerusalem. Let the house be rebuilt, a place for offering sacrifices, with a base built up high. Let it be 60 cubits high and 60 cubits wide.
Good. Just to point it out, there's no length to the building. It's a building of height and width.
How two-dimensional.
Well, that's what it looked like in the original map, on the plans.
If you stand in the right place, it looks good.
There were
Makes you
no
feel like
good
you're in a
three
box,
dimensions until the Renaissance. It's all about perspective.
With a course of unused timber for each 3 courses of hewn stone. The expenses shall be paid by the palace. And the gold and silver vessels of the house of God, which how'd you say it in English? Nebuchadnezzar had taken away from the temple of Jerusalem and transferred to Babylon, shall be returned, and that each go back to the temple in Jerusalem where it belongs. You shall deposit it in the house of God.
Right. So here we have now another text of the Edict of Cyrus, which is similar, sort of agrees in general with the text we have from Ezra 1, from the end of Chronicles, but a couple of important differences. Anybody pull important differences out of their head? According to Ezra 1 and the end of Chronicles, why is Cyrus letting the captives go home to build God's house? It's not here. The Lord God of heaven has given me all the kingdoms of the earth and has charged me with building him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. It's not here, right? So the written record of finding it in the archives in the summer palace doesn't have Cyrus sort of professing revelation from Jewish God, right? From our God, from the God.
He said that God told me to do it.
He said God told me to do it. In fact, every other version that we have in the Tanakh, 2 Chronicles, 1st chapter of Ezra, has sort of Cyrus the prophet. And the tradition will call him Cyrus the Messiah. But the text in Ezra 6 doesn't have that. Good? Good. So it's fun for whatever it's worth. You know, one of the taglines that's often given to the Bible is, the world's most quoted book. Within the Bible, more than the 10 Commandments, the Edict of Cyrus is the single most quoted document. I think that's true. Yeah, I mean, there are expressions that appear many, many more times, right? But in terms of referring to another work, we have references actually in kings to the annals or the chronicles of the kings of Israel. But in terms of actually quoting from another source, the Edict of Cyrus appears multiple times.
And that would be in Ezra-Nechemiah and several of the prophets, I assume?
Second Chronicles, Isaiah, Second Chronicles, and now twice in Ezra. Maybe in Nehemiah. We'll have to see when we get there. I don't remember. All right. You have more fun names. Vanina?
Okay. Nai Utatnai, governor of the province of beyond the river, Shetar Boznai and colleagues, the officials of the province of beyond the river, stay away from that place. Allow the work of this house of God to go on. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God on its site.
Good. So here you have Darius reaffirming the Cyrus's edict and making it clear that there is now here a level of self-governance. Originally we have Zerubbabel, or Belteshazzar, I think Zerubbabel, appointed as governor. And then we have a period of time where it's clear that the returnees are under the governance of Persian-appointed non-Judeans. And now again, under Darius, we have the assertion that the Judeans, or the returning Judeans, have some measure of self-rule, that they get to take care of themselves and they should be left alone.
And I hereby issue an order concerning what you must do to help these elders of the Jews rebuild this house of God. The expenses are to be paid to these men with dispatch out of the resources of the king, derived from the taxes of the province of beyond the river, so that the work not be stopped. They are to be given daily without fail, whatever they need of young bulls, rams, or lambs, as burnt offerings for the God of heaven, and wheat, salt, wine, and oil at the order of the priests in Jerusalem, so that they may offer pleasing sacrifices to the God of heaven and pray for the life of the king and his sons.
Good. So now this goes one step farther than we had before. Right? So not only is it returning the treasure, but they actually become public officiants. Right? They're paid by the collective taxes. And the taxes collected by the Persians. Pretty cool. You have like the first official, you have the first official chief rabbinate, they're not rabbis, but chief priests who are appointed and paid by the non-Jewish overlords. Different system, right? So what this is doing textually is setting up the whole period of the Second Temple. And we, by vantage of more than 2,000 years of history, we often lump them together. We say the two temples, and there was the first temple, and there was a little bit of a vacation, and there was a second temple, and so forth. But they're different in all sorts of fundamental ways. And a lot of it we can see right here, in terms of who's in charge, but who appoints them to be in charge, who's collecting taxes, right? During First Temple times, the taxes were not collected by non-Jewish authorities and then dispersed to the temple. It was under kingship that it was done.
It's interesting that there seems to be this, that the non-Jewish authorities want the God of Israel to be reminded for good of the Persian government.
Nice.
They are to be, here, they want to sacrifice a bull, please give it to them and let them sacrifice a bull. And it is interesting that in a way that is the start of religions having a responsibility to pray for whoever it is that is in charge.
Correct, even if it's not of the same group. Mm-hmm. Right? It's one thing to pray for the well-being of Saul or David or Solomon and so forth. But, our tradition of praying for our country and its leaders. Now here you have, not only has that become the tradition, but, you have the non-Judean ruler saying, provide them with what they need so they can pray for my well-being.
Well, how come at any time, forgive my ignorance, but at any time there's always the threat of the Jews, the threat of rising, and here It is giving the power to the Jews to rise.
Nice. And in fact, what we saw earlier in Ezra is the concern that this is a rebellious people. And what we have is a changing of the old guard and a different way of exploring or of relating. You know, the easy comparison is to the Assyrians who conquered the northern kingdom, who, when they conquered, they really conquered. And they dragged away people, and they brought in foreign people, and they mixed everybody together, and they made everybody Assyrians. The Babylonians, who dragged off just the nobility and said, you won't rebel because we have your kings and priests hanging out in Babylon, and if you don't pay us taxes, it's not going to go well for your king. And now, especially now, we're still not in the late Persian Empire, but we're not under Cyrus or really the interspanning years when Babylon revolts against Persia. And so a lot of the early part of Ezra, we think that the fear of a rebellion in Judah is related to the Persian Empire's need to put down a rebellion from Babylon after they conquered the Babylonians. But now we have a fully developed foreign policy, perhaps some form of colonialism. That is where you get to be who you are, and we will honor and validate that, but we will still get to collect taxes. That is, it's easy for the king to be generous and give back some percentage of the taxes that he's collecting from there. Right? We read this and we say, isn't it nice that the king of Persia is willing to support them from the taxes? But the reality is, if they hadn't been conquered, then all of those taxes would belong there. So, it's a perspective thing that says the king says, no, I'm generous. You can keep a third of all the taxes we collect, which makes it, some kind of enlightened colonialism rather than taking everything back just for the mother country. But it is, it's much better than Assyrian diplomacy. It's much better than Babylonian diplomacy. It's not as good as independence. It has benefits from independence. The Judean army at this point is as large as the Persian army. So that's one of the values of being dependent upon the Persian Empire, is the Persian Empire will defend Judah, which is important when the Greeks start to come in. But the downside is they're not independent.
I also issue an order that whoever alters this decree shall have a beam removed from his house, and he shall be impaled on it, and his house confiscated. Oh.
Good. Finish the rest of the curse, and then we'll talk about the curse.
And may the God who established his name there cause the downfall of any king or nation that undertakes or alter the damage to the house of God in Jerusalem. I, Darius, have issued the decree that it be carried out with dispatch.
Good. So, you like that?
Quite an image.
Well, we got two images. So, if an individual, if one of the governors of or appointees from Persia decides to change this, what should happen to him?
His house becomes structurally unsound.
And it's not even just that they pull out a beam so that the house falls upon him. It's like insult to injury, right? Because that very beam they then use to goose him good.
Hoisted on his own beam.
Exactly. And he loses his house anyway, which is a little bit sort of funny. So the footnote there is that Uvate Navlu Yitabed Aldna. Nivalu Yitabed, that his house will surely be lost. Probably a better translation.
Because it won't stand.
That's right.
So, exactly. So that whole confiscated thing doesn't matter once you make it structurally unsound. But that's for the individual. And what happens to if somebody comes to attack them? Again, this is part of the benefit of colonialism.
God punishes the nation that has caused the trouble.
Correct. If the Babylonians decide that they want to be in charge of Judah again, or the upstart Greeks, if the Hellenes decide to come over and they want to do it, then Darius is calling down, a curse of the God of heaven. I like to say the Jewish God, which is problematic for all sorts of reasons, but I like it nonetheless, upon them. It's a great curse. And it happens both. Now, we know something about... Now, here we have all of this, by the way, is Darius supporting the edict of a king 2 kings prior. Right? It's not the Edict of Darius. Darius is just saying we have to live by Cyrus and do it in the right way, and anybody who messes with that is going to be very, very unhappy. We have another biblical example of Persian kings bound by their edicts. Biblical. How many other Persian kings do we have in the Bible?
Yeah, but Haman had his edict, so they.
Right, but exactly. But it's not Haman's edict; it's the king's edict, and the king gets stuck because there it's not even honoring his predecessors; it's honoring his mood from the day before. It's done. So this, whatever Darius really thought, however things actually developed, whatever the conversation was behind closed doors, the textual memory of it here, in that sense, looks exactly like the Esther story. That once the king sets his seal upon it, even later generations are bound by it. And God help, right? God help the person or the nation that goes against an edict of the current king of Persia or any prior king of Persia. Even the king himself, if he should try and undo his earlier edict. So we have this, as opposed to, that is in line with some of the challenges for institutions that have things like infallibility. Course corrections or undoing the past are really difficult, right? And so, as a legislatively, we have zero problem undoing prior legislation. You just might more legislation, and you have an amendment to do what you want, and then you have another amendment to undo the amendment because you no longer want that done. It's not a problem. Now, the place where you have a problem, and it's not as big as in Persia, but it's more complicated than the legislative challenges, is in the judiciary. That is, to undo precedent is a bigger deal in the judiciary. Congress has no problems. You get enough votes, and you could undo, whatever you like. Next day, exactly. Which is interesting, because we don't write laws in stone. We often don't even get them to have the ink dry. And it's really, really important. You look at, they've been reading part of the House of Representatives record from the debate on the Defense of Marriage Act. And it's really interesting. It's 1996. It's not that long ago. How different it reads. Plenty of people who didn't like it in 1996. But even with that, it reads really, really different. As opposed to, there are 100-year-old, 200-year-old decisions of the courts that are read in a very, very different way because it's not as easy as just convincing 5 out of 9 just to change their mind and to redo a prior decision. It's much more complicated. So, kind of neat, but still less complicated than here, by the way. Or I would assume in the Vatican.
Still in all, he found it. It took the trouble, and they found the edict. I wonder if they could have just decided that they didn't want to find it.
Nice. Which clearly they could have, because it wasn't even in the first place they looked. And so, however it ended up in the Summer Palace, it was, we know that we have other textual references that the kings read their histories, right? We have that from Esther, we have that from the book of Ezra also. So that's like summer reading. The Edict of Cyrus, keep that in the Summer Palace. That's not cold weather reading. It's summer reading.
It's something light.
Yeah, I don't know. One more thing. In verse 12, and may the God who established his name, in the Aramaic, Ve'alaha di shakein shmei tama. So Allah is Ha-Elohim. Di is She. Right? We have it, God is Yishkon, God who dwells. It's the same word that gives us Shekhinah, that part of God. It's the same word that gives us Mishkan, God's dwelling place. Shmei, God's name. Tama, Sham, there. Right? So it's a lovely, here in the mouth of Darius, but it's awfully good, Jewish praise of God language. So I don't know if it's reflective of a diction or a way of speaking that one could also find in non-Jewish documents, or it really is an example of the author understanding, whether it was Darius or whether this is just the telling of the story, about how one speaks of the God of the people of Judah. Ve'la hadi shakin shmei tama.
Interesting. Yeah, my sense is that the way we use Hebrew is not dissimilar from the way other Canaanite speakers used Canaanite and Aramaic speakers used Aramaic. That you see occasional reflections of the Psalms, but in a pagan environment. And if you go to Ugaritic, you even find some of the same moral sensitivities that emerge in Hebrew.
Nice, I think so. I don't know specifically in terms of this example, but it's really neat. And, and some of it is interesting to follow chronologically, for those texts that we can clearly date, to understand both how the language develops and how the interplay between civilizations, in each with its own language, how they interact together as well. I can't walk down the hallway anymore at State because Khalil Muhammad does a lot of Quran and Haditha literature and its relation to Hebrew Bible and its relation to rabbinic texts, which is funny because he knows nothing about it, and so he's got his list of rabbis that he knows and trusts. Whenever he comes across something, he says, anywhere in rabbinic literature where Abraham is talked about like this, or it's a bad floor plan that the men's room is right by Khalil's office because I can't go to the bathroom. It takes me an hour. It's just, a really neat article actually about folklore motifs related to Abraham. I forget exactly which motifs. Anyway, anybody wants it, ask me later. All right, verse 13. Sorry.
Then Tabnai, governor of the province of beyond the river, Shethar-bozenai, and their colleagues carried out with dispatch what King Darius had written. So the elders of the Jews progressed in the building, urged on by the prophesying of Agai, the prophet of Zechariah, son of Iddo, and then brought the building to completion under the aegis of the God of Israel, and by the order of Cyrus and Darius, and King Artaxerxes of Persia. The house was finished on the 3rd of the month of Adar.
I'm sorry, I want to stop you. I'm just... Ooh. The verbs are fascinating. Okay, so what happens in verse 14? We should get past it too quickly.
They went on, and
what did they do? They didn't just go on.
They prospered.
And they didn't just prosper. What did they do?
They
They finished
finished
it. V'shachlilu.
who brought the building to completion. Yeah.
They finished it.
They finished the building according to the command of God.
Right?
With the urging of Haggai and Zechariah.
Good. So we talked about that a little bit last week. I think it was last week. In terms of Haggai and Zechariah are the prophets who find the temple project stalled, and they scream and holler, and it gets rebuilt. And we have a different memory of that in the beginning of Ezra chapter 5. But the same basic narrative, that what they had done had stalled. And we have different reasons for it in Haggai and Zechariah than we have in Ezra. And then it starts up again. And we have the doubling that it's about God, and it's about the kings of Persia. We have... it's really easy to rush past it. We'll pick it up. It'll be the theme through the end of the chapter. But they did it. They completed the building.
But they were given the right tools.
They were given the right tools. They were given financial support. They were given all of those things.
So.
But this is, in Shul, not this Shabbos, but next week we'll read Shmini. We'll read the completion and the establishment of the altar in the desert, right? And on the 8th day, Aaron will offer the first sacrifice on it. The fire will come down from God, and this is it, right? This is what, all the times they sang Psalm 137 in Babylon, right, where we wept. Now it's rebuilt. And so as much as they offered sacrifices in Ezra 1 or 2, Ezra 1, the temple's built. And which kings of Persia are given credit?
The three.
Cyrus, Darius, Artaxerxes.
Good. And under whose reign was the temple completed?
Darius.
So why is Artaxerxes, God's, absolutely. Why is Artaxerxes given credit? The temple's completed under the reign of Darius. Excuse me.
Presumably, first of all, is it the case that Artaxerxes is in between the two of them, or
No, he comes after Darius.
after?
Really?
So
Gave you the chart last week.
I'm guessing that he provided protection.
You can guess whatever you want to guess.
Really?
But, it's sort of like,
Late editing.
I don't know.
Quite, about 100 years.
Well, it depends. Again, there's confusion in the world of Artaxerxes because there actually are two Artaxerxes. And there's a Xerxes who follows Darius. So there's confusion as it relates to the names as to who's who. But no matter what, they all succeed Darius. And they all come after, years after, a couple of decades after the completion of the rebuilding of the temple. So as to what it's doing here, I don't know. There are different theories out there. But we have to note it. We have to pay enough attention to realize, given...
It says it was completed in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius.
Correct. So that's verse 15.
So
I didn't finish the verse. So...
I mean, it could be that it was completed functionally in the 6th year of Darius, but as UCSD hasn't been completed yet, and the buildings keep going up, I'm wondering whether
subsequent presidents are getting credit for the founding.
Yes, and now we've got the wall around it built.
Good. And in fact, we'll see that in Nehemiah, that the completion of everything will happen much later. Right? Notice that we're in the 6th chapter of the book of Ezra. We haven't met Ezra yet. Right? Ezra hasn't appeared. He'll appear pretty soon, next week. But the temple's completed, the building itself is completed, but everything else won't be completed until the book of Nehemiah, until the reign of Artaxerxes. So that's a possibility. Another possibility has to do with the dating of the writing of the book.
Yeah,
That is, you want to give, it doesn't hurt to give credit to the current king. There's always room to give more honor to somebody else.
They can put up a tree.
Exactly.
When they say
One more plaque.
So the elders of the Jews.
What verse are you in?
The beginning of 14.
Okay.
So who are these elders at this point? Who's nailing the
plaque on the wall?
Those are the
they're
ones that
mentioned
came
before,
back
the elders.
from Babylon, aren't they?
Well, elders is
an honorific?
a title of authority. As to what exactly does it apply to, but we see the elders in all sorts of books.
Yeah.
We see, and they become important in rabbinic literature. We see the elders by the gates in the book of Ruth.
Yeah.
Right? So the elders of the community. We see it in the book of Exodus, where you bring them out to the elders who are in the gates of the city. You see it in...
He sits among the elders of the husbands.
That's right. He sits among the elders. Good. In Proverbs. Yep.
So it's just a general term here. We're not...
No, I don't think so. I think it is, whether it is a relatively generic, like we would say the machers of a community, or whether it's a specific title, like the Parnasim, for a lot of the Middle Ages, the title of Parnas or Parnasim were really the leaders of the community. So whether it was as formal as the Council of Presidents of Major Jewish, whatever that organization is, whether it's that formal, but it seems to have that there are people who are acknowledged to be the elders, and it's the institution, by the way, that breeds the sages, and it's from the sages from which the title of rabbi will develop. But those are the memory of the community. Those are the moral compass of the community. I have no idea if one only has to be old enough to be qualified, or if it's a more formal.
Well, it's a lot like
Kind of
the
that.
Arabic word for sheikh means elder, and that's the leader of the community. So it's
How are they
a title
chosen?
and a designation.
Don't know. I don't know. So funny you say elder in that context, and my mind thinks of Mormons, but because they don't have to be very old for the
But I mean,
title.
in that culture, you look at it as a generic title for leadership.
Well, there certainly must have been some both clerical and secular Jewish institutions that were very important to the community. So I would guess that there's a board of governors and there's a few top priests and some.
Well, there's definitely a hierarchy in the priesthood,
Yeah.
right? We have the strong distinction from Kohanim to Leviim. We have high priest and subordinate priests. But then we even in Second Temple times have a strong development of priestly clans or of cousins. You know, that's where the tension in the Passover story. You know, the Hashmonaim are out as being the ruling clan of priests in Jerusalem. You know, people make a similar argument about the Essenes as a group of priests who have left Jerusalem because it's become dirty. But that's all later, Second Temple times. Good. All right.
All right. The house was finished on the 3rd of the month of Adar, in the 6th year of the reign of King Darius.
Okay, so Adar, most immediate connection with Adar? Purim. Right, so we're in the Persian world. Interesting, the issues of Purim. Now, we usually think this the other way, but what month of the year is Adar?
February-ish.
That's the time of year it is, right?
It's the last one.
It's the 12th month, right? So it's the end of something, getting ready for the beginning of something, right? No, so it's the beginning of the month of Adar, and there's a question to what extent we're historical and to what extent we have folkloric memory, and I'll come back to that in the continuation. But it's neat. We're in a Persian text, we're in the month of Adar, and we're in the time of new beginnings, and we are in the last month of the year leading up to the new year. All fits together. All right, do you want to keep reading? Vanina, or you want to pass the baton?
Anybody want to say?
Well, I am having a crisis with my contact lens, so
I'll read.
Oh,
Verse 16, the top of page 1848.
Okay.
The very top line.
The Israelites, the priests, and the Levites, all the other exiles celebrated the dedication of the house of God with joy. And they sacrificed for the dedication of this house of God 100 bulls, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and 12 goats as a purification offering for all of Israel, according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They appointed the priests in their courses and the Levites in their divisions for the service of God in Jerusalem, according to the prescription in the book of Moses.
Nice. All right, comments?
two things. One is the reference to the book of Moses, which I take to be probably our current Torah. And the other is that purification offering for all of Israel according to the number of the tribes of Israel, which is really interesting because arguably there's 1, 2, or 3, or 4, the Shimonites, Benjaminites, Judites, and Levites, but it's usually collapsed down to just Judites.
Good. So go back to 16. And already we have the trifold split between Kohanim, Leviim, and Yisrael. Right? So rather than Kohen, Levi, and Judah, which would seem to make sense, also those who returned are not called Judeans. It's nice that here they call them exiles, which is a funny word for them because they're in Jerusalem. So I don't know who you call an exile in Jerusalem, right? The original is B'nai Galuta, which you could translate, which is the way JPS does, following the Bnei Yisrael as some kind of generic, Bnei Yisrael are the Israelites, but not literally. They're literally the children of Israel. And in the same way, Bnei Galuta, they say the exiles, but it could also be the children of the exile. Right? It could be, one could choose to more literally understand it because that is who they are. They're not exiles anymore, right? Because they're in Jerusalem, but they are still Bnei Galuta. And in terms of the distinction between those who never left, right? It's sort of like, you're a child of France, right? So we may all be Americans, and whether we do it nationally or we do it regionally, I'm a child of Ohio, right? But there's an identifier there. I think the expression Bnei Galuta identifies them clearly as a group whose birth origin is in Galus, is in Bavel, and then they come back.
Because they do mention Bnei Israel.
Correct.
So I'm confused. Where are they in the kingdoms? Because you got Israelites, but you're in Jerusalem.
Correct. We're in Jerusalem, and in fact, if you look backwards, one's going to have to go back pretty far to see this group of people called Israelites before. I'm wary to say it's the first time in the book that we've seen him refer to that, but it's been a while.
Chapter 3, verse 1.
That counts as a while.
Yeah,
So
yes.
the expression here, we're in a world of ritual, and so ritual has a sense of the typological about it, so that it's not, the temple is not for the Judeans, and so there are 12 goats. There's not one goat, right? It's not just the goat for Judah, but the house is the house of God, and God is the God of all Israel. Wherever the other tribes may be, whatever else is true. And the promise is about all 12 tribes of Bnei Yisrael, not just Judah. And if you separate out the Levites, right, which is done here, they're a separate category from the Israelites, then there are 12 tribes. Right? The only legitimate way to count, and count one if you want to just say Judah, but take Joseph as his two children, and get rid of Levi, and you get 12. So you have the 12 tribes, separate from the Leviim and the Kohanim, and you have I'm missing the word that I want, it's anachronistic certainly, but you have a fantasy, a vision of all of the house of Israel, or all of the children of Israel present.
Well, when the Assyrians swept down on the northern kingdom, there were refugees too. They didn't completely wipe them all out.
Correct.
There were refugees who fled south, and I'm sure there were remnants of the other 10 tribes.
So
Mixed in with the group that ended up in Babylon.
And the question would be whether they kept
Their
identity.
separate identities, or married in or melded with the
I'm
rest
sure
of
they
Israel.
married in, but they...
But keeping their separate identity, it's an interesting thing.
It
Tracking your family history.
It would be lovely if we could see some
Well,
point.
they did list at the beginning,
who's in?
the son of.
Correct. We get the
ex-wife
kosher
and-
list of all the people who came back who are
and
on
all
the A
their-
list.
And all their children.
But that's
And there
the-
were some doubtfuls that showed up there too.
We'll
Yeah.
get in chapter 9. We had to get the building built, and now we have to dedicate it. But we'll get to in chapter 9, and we're chugging along nicely at a chapter a week, which is pretty cool. So not too far away. We'll get to some of the relations between the Bnei Galuta, those who were born in Galut and came back, and those who never left. Okay, and that will come to the fore. We saw a little piece of it maybe in the opening chapter, depending on how we read it, but we'll see it explicitly.
What does that mean, Rabbi, when they say according to the number of the tribes of Israel? It means that in the sacrifices they would have less.
No, 12 goats. Whenever you see the number 12,
Right.
12 is a symbolic number. We see it in terms of the writing of names in Ezekiel. We see it in the stones that get put together to rebuild the altar. 12 is the number for all the children of Israel. The 12 stones on the breastplate, on the ephod.
But what about the 200 rams and the 400 lambs?
Well, they gotta eat something.
Exactly. They had a big feast.
Is it divided up according to the number of people or the rank?
The interesting parallel is if you look at the dedication in Solomon, and they killed a lot more animals in the first temple. So there are comments that it has to do with the number of people. There are far fewer people here than there were when Solomon dedicated the first temple, or a poverty statement that this isn't the great wealth of the kingdom that Solomon had. Those numbers look big to me. By the way, for whatever it's worth, that's a good day at the slaughterhouse.
Yeah.
Going through that many animals.
I'm sorry that we have this paltry feast of 400 lambs.
I didn't jot down the parallel text from 1 Kings, but the numbers are bigger. Those numbers are bigger.
Yeah.
It's striking that it's 200 rams, but 400 lambs. That's
Wow.
Well,
It doesn't take as many rams.
and besides, people prefer lamb to mutton.
Mutton. I like that.
What do we call it? We don't.
Bill's a troll.
but somebody was raising a lot of cattle.
Correct. So there are lots to be said about sacrifices and about meat and about eating the meat and whatever else. All right, stuff that I'm excited about, and we made it. I also want to say, Bill pointed out that it's written in the book of Moses, but the term Torah is not used here. Mm-hmm. It is used in the book of Ezra, but it's not used. Excuse me. It's not used in this expression. Just as an observation. If you would go on. Thank you, Jackie.
The return to exile celebrated the Passover.
I'm going to interrupt you for 1 second, just as you start. We're now going to swap languages again. This time we don't get any statement that says Ivrit. We had that word before, Aramit, at the end of chapter 4, I think, or in chapter 3, wherever we swap languages. But we're back into biblical Hebrew. You can hear in Jackie's tone that she switched languages. Sorry.
For the priests and Levites had purified themselves to a man. They were all pure. They slaughtered the Passover offering for all the returned exiles, and for their brother priests and for themselves.
Okay, stop there. So we mentioned that it was Adar at the end of the year. Now we get into the first month of the year, full moon of that month, Pesach.
Did you see the full moon last night?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
I didn't see it. Where was I? Passover. Passover for dedication of the temple. It's not what we normally remember it. Passover shows up. Vanina was here. Kobo was here. Talked about Passover in terms of the Haftarot on the first 2 days of Pesach.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember?
The first one was Joshua.
Good.
Hmm?
First one was from Joshua.
Yeah.
Haftarah?
Yes.
It was.
And the second is Uzziah?
And the second one was from 2 Kings, King Josiah. And both of those,
It's like the only two righteous kings we had, which went from Joshua in the first one. And
well, Joshua was not really a king,
not really.
but the role of Passover, in a way that we don't normally acknowledge it, as being the communal festival of nationhood. Now, in some ways, if it were only Joshua, it would make sense that they celebrate Passover right before the conquest of the land. It's the purpose of the Exodus. I mean, you could do it. But then it shows up in Hezekiah and Josiah. We read Josiah. The chapter, that's chapter 35. That's chapter, in Chronicles, it's in chapter 35. In chapter 30, Hezekiah also makes a big fuss with religious reforms in Passover. That there is a biblical association with Pesach having to do with national identity and with some kind of ritual purity or ritual reformation or something. And here we have it at the dedication of the Second Temple. That we don't normally think of Passover in those terms. I mean, I don't. I think my mind goes to Egypt. matzah.
The holiday at the beginning of the Jewish year, so liturgical.
Correct, but the idea that it's about New Year, and the idea that it's about national identity, I don't even if that's the best.
Moving from slavery to freedom, from Egypt to Israel. I mean, it's the same idea. You're moving from one place to another. The exiles
It's
are
like
returning.
independence.
I think so, but we wouldn't normally. Okay, I mean maybe it just flows more naturally for the two of you. The Independence Day connection, I think, is right. Right, the Independence Day connection of this people with a new identity. In this case, it's a return to the old identity, but there's no mention of Passover Exodus, right? And of Egypt Exodus rather, and specifically. And when we think of Passover for us in terms of storytelling as narrative, it's a narrative of leaving, not a narrative of arriving.
Right.
So it appears the way that it is used as a biblical motif is it's more about, I think, a narrative of arriving to a place of national identity. Okay? So that's what happens through the Exodus from Egypt, is we really become the nation of Israel. That's what happens at the Jordan River with Joshua. We really become the nation of Israel. That's what happens with Hezekiah and Josiah, that we really return to our authentic, kosher roots, as it were, and we again become the nation of Israel. That's what happens in the time, again, we're still pre-Ezra, but under the reign of King Darius, that we really, again, those who are B'nai Galuta, or here B'nai Golah, B'nai HaGolah, again create a national identity through proper religious observance according to the book of Moses, celebrated and affirmed through the festival of Pesach. It's pretty funky. Now there's another part to the Passover narrative that we don't always tell, right? What's the rule about who's not invited to the Passover?
Anyone who's a stranger or foreigner.
But it's even more specific. It's anybody who has a little bit extra skin. Right? It's the uncircumcised, which is why in the Joshua narrative, that's the great, post-desert circumcision, because they didn't observe Milah in the desert. So before they enter the land, they have to all be circumcised, and then they get to celebrate Passover. Okay? So what are the great national identities? We normally associate circumcision not with Passover, but as, Brit Avraham Avinu, as the covenant with Abraham our father, for obvious, because that's where it comes from in the narrative. But circumcision is connected to the Passover narrative. We have the crazy piece of circumcision in terms of Moses' son, which is related to the Passover, the Exodus narrative, though it's very confusing, and who knows how it's really related to whatever else, but it's part of that story, and it's circumcision. We have, and so the connection with circumcision related to Passover, not related to Abraham. No Abraham mentioned in here, right? Is the association, and I think Jackie didn't read I got a verse ahead of myself there. I'm going to read verse 21. Let's get circumcision into it.
Okay, the children of Israel, who had returned from the exile, together with all who joined them in separating themselves from the uncleanness of the nations of the land, to worship the Lord God of Israel, 8 of it.
All right, so 8 of it is related to the Passover sacrifice. And how does one separate oneself from the uncleanliness of the nations of the land in order to be able to eat of the Korban Pesach? Circumcision. That's the only way to get to eat.
They can't relate to Abraham because it was not a nation at that time. As with Moses, there's more of a sense of nation formed.
Okay, good. I agree. However, I will tell you that rabbinically, when circumcision comes up, Abraham comes up.
That's true, okay.
Circumcision doesn't come up in the context. I mean, again, if you're talking about the Tzipporah story, or if you're talking about the circumcision of Joshua, those parts aren't denied. But if you were to say, what's the association with matzah? People say the Exodus from Egypt. I mean, again, rabbinically, that's the common connection. If you say, what's the association with Milah? People may say Elijah, which is nice, but people say Abraham, because that's where it comes from. And the Elijah thing is really fun, because Elijah bridges both narratives. He's not in the Abraham narrative, But Elijah's part and parcel of the circumcision narrative for us, and Elijah's part and parcel of the Passover narrative for us, but we don't usually associate circumcision in the Passover narrative. But the Tanakh does. The narrative does. Kind of funky.
Well, especially when you've been sort of out of the loop for a few generations, or either wandering in the desert or in exile. And you have to reaffirm your presence as part of this group again.
Correct.
Identity. Instead of Independence Day, we should call it Identity Day.
Excuse me.
I find this line about together with all who joined them in separating themselves from the uncleanliness of the nations. I don't think of there being a vast number of converts coming in at that. And this is this is a really tough period of time. And that might also imply that some of the locals...
Probably have intermarried.
Pardon?
They probably have intermarried.
Oh, we're going to... I guess we haven't gotten there yet, have we?
Ezra-9.
Yeah, they get chucked out.
So, but Bill's question is, to offer more broadly, is who are these who have separated themselves from the uncleanliness of the nations of the earth? Right? It's a neat question. But it's clearly a group, or individuals, who have made a positive step to become part of it. So whether they were, Jews or descendants of the other Israelites, or whether they were some form of non-Jews becoming Jewish, without ancestral roots, unclear here.
And it could be, thinking about the United States, the pre-United States, the colonies, where you have a frontier, people trying to settle in. It's a chance for a second start for a lot of people. So I suppose, I don't think we'll see any. I look forward to seeing whether there are any more references to this being the Golden Medina that America became for the Jews of Eastern Europe and for the Chinese too.
I'm thinking of the Soviet Jews who went to Israel and they, hadn't been circumcised or any of that, and they had to come back and get
And the whole question, in our lifetime, the issue of Soviet Jews and the Ethiopian Jews in terms of how they are or are not accepted. So one of them, circumcision, is an easy one because it's, generally speaking, for the vast majority of men, it's easy to know whether or not a male has been circumcised. And circumcision is a requirement. So that's one. But issues of bloodlines, of Jewish mom stuff. Correct. Well, but the question is, what does it prove and how to do that? But with Soviet immigrants to Israel, proving their family history, right? Because children of intermarriage could be stamped on their passport as Jews, but that doesn't mean that the Rabbanut would identify them halachically as Jews. And there's a whole big issue of Beitar Yisrael, of the Ethiopians who came in, into whether or not they needed to go through some kind of collective conversion process to be accepted by the Rabbanut in Israel.
Indeed, some of them were tricked into it.
Fascinating and problematic contemporary history. But some of the parallel is here. What we have here is a reference.
It doesn't look so surprising when you think of it.
It doesn't. In fact, that priestly mentality, that Levitical mentality, that understanding of clear delineation between in and out, right, which we don't find in much of the Torah world outside of the book of Leviticus. We have all sorts of issues, whether it's about intermarriage or people's identity and people who join, and it's a much more fluid understanding. In some ways, it's the distinction. For me, the easiest place to see it as it relates to Torah text is Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. Genesis 2 being the dominant view of most of the Torah, which is fluid and things flow into each other and the boundaries are never clear in Genesis 2. In Genesis 1, everything is exactly in its place. Right? So Genesis 1 is the priestly mentality. Right? That's and Ezra is clearly a community that will now be dominated by priesthood for centuries.
You know what would be interesting is to take it and say, omit some of the words and say, together with all who join them,
Nice.
to worship the Lord God of Israel.
Nice. You want to edit it to make it prettier.
Well, to make it the purpose also, I mean, it's just joining a nation and say, okay, I'm going to be part of that big party. You know, it smells good, it tastes great, but there's also another purpose behind it, is really adopting what they are about.
Mm-hmm. Nice. And we don't get much of the motivation of this group. We don't get who they are, or we don't, nor their motivation for doing it. It's an interesting translation of the verb lidrosh. So I don't know, now that we're back to Hebrew, in Ezra to pay attention. I don't recall seeing the verb. Well, now that I say that, I actually think, the verb that here is translated as to worship is really to seek out, which is a lovely understanding, but it's different. Normally the verb to worship is to serve, right? We call it la'avod. But I just had a quick thought. As to whether or not when they send the letter, no, that's Darius' name. I don't see that verb used there. It's just an interesting verb to use because, you know, as a parallel, Rebecca goes lidrosh et Adonai, right? When she wants to figure out what's going on inside her belly, she goes to ask God, to seek from God. Certainly wouldn't translate that as worship in that context. So as to using this verb to mean worship, it would be interesting to check. The concordance right behind me. It's not there.
I see Jasper over there.
No, I can see it on the screen. I don't know. I'll find it. I don't know of a usage of lidrosh that I would be comfortable saying it means to worship. And as opposed to here, where they all gather together to seek God or to ask God. Right? And just in terms, it's interesting, the English implies that they ate it is at the end of the verse. And it's actually the very first word of the verse. So word order is funny in terms of translation. It implies something different, perhaps. Anyway, let's get the last verse so we can complete the chapter and make it dominion.
Okay.
Bill, you want to read one verse?
Sure.
They joyfully celebrated the Feast of Unleavened Bread for 7 days. For the Lord had given them cause for joy by inclining the heart of the Assyrian king toward them so as to give them support in work of the house of God, the God of Israel.
Nice. All right. A couple fun thoughts. The Assyrian king. We've seen a blurring of national titles for the kings of Persia. Right? I think Darius, one of them was called the Babylonian king in the previous chapter. So I guess the nice thing is if you have one of these great empires that spans multiple nations, you can take multiple titles. But Darius as the king of Assyria is an interesting title. Molechet Beit Elohim, it's one of those good verbs. Also for the work of God's house. Anything else?
You said you were having a thought you were saving for the end.
So the thought that I was saving for the end, we got to, it's this connection with Passover. It's the connection with things that I don't think of as part of the Passover narrative, that biblically, if we just read one of them, it would be easy to not think too much about it. But when we go from Joshua to Hezekiah to Josiah to the time of Ezra, again, to the book of Ezra, that's a lot of association from temple to Passover, not about sacrifice, but about dedication or rededication, things that I would do either as Hanukkah or as Sukkot, but are clearly about Passover and the explicit connection from Passover to circumcision. Are two interesting things that aren't usually associated in my head that now, I figure I have 11 months and 3 weeks till next year Passover. Yeah.
Well, you have to, even if you go back to Moses' time, if you go back that far, they followed him because they thought they were going, to go directly to land and prosper and so forth. But then, when he was up on the mountain, they did the golden calf. And so they were uncertain. And it was maybe 40 years before they really got to build the tabernacle and everything. And there's quite a few generations before they finished the second temple.
Correct. There's a couple of generations.
So they rededicating themselves.
I agree. But the thing that fascinates me is the association to Passover.
But that's why the association is with Passover.
Okay.
Because, in other words, they changed, they converted. Because when they were under Egypt, they followed the Egyptian laws and customs.
Okay. To be continued next week, and we should have class next Thursday. We're going back to 4 o'clock. I've got a bar mitzvah coming up in a few weeks. I have to meet with him at 5. And next week, in the 7th chapter, we will finally get to the character named Ezra in the book of Ezra, where we are. 6/10 of the way finished.